Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
And now we have Magdalena Edwards to talk about Clarice Lispector's The Chandelier, which we're very excited about. Magdalena is a writer, translator, and actor based in LA. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from UCLA and a BA in social studies from Harvard. Born in Santiago, Chile, and raised in Chicago, LA, and DC. And Christiana Soto Vanderplas of LARB says, Chandelier is not a book to be read at a fast pace, but rather one to be slowly sipped and savored, a few pages at a time, one that forces us to find other modes of reading, of approaching literature, committed to finding the pleasures of the text. Here she is.
It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about Clarice Lispector and her second novel, The Chandelier. This morning, I actually was on a Skype call for about 2 hours with the bilingual Brazilian book club based in London at the Brazilian embassy there, and it was fascinating because these are very intense, voracious readers of literature and Brazilian literature, and I learned a lot of new things about Clarice. That's one of the things I've loved about working on her writing, is that she never ceases to surprise, and she always has something up her sleeve. It's like she doesn't want to be pinned down. She's so playful that way. I wanted to say a few things about the book and about her work. How many of you are familiar with her work? Okay, fantastic. As many of you know, she was born in the Ukraine to a Jewish family who had to flee because of pogroms, and so they ended up in Brazil. They might have moved to the United States because they also had relatives there, and I've always found it fascinating that Lispector might have ended up being an English language writer. But that's not what happened. Her family went to Brazil, and that's where she grew up and learned Portuguese and became essentially a Brazilian. This is her second novel that she started writing in 1943. She was a newlywed. She had just finished law school. She married one of her law school classmates who was a diplomat. And in fact, in order to marry him, she wrote a letter to the president of Brazil at the time to ask him to expedite her citizenship because diplomats could not be married to non-citizens. And it's a very interesting letter where she talks about being this Russian girl but who doesn't speak the language, and if she got sent back to Russia would not be able to exist there because that's not her place. And so that idea of somebody with a hybridity in terms of identity and culture, background, someone who's an immigrant, is present throughout her writing, and I think makes her writing especially urgent in a way today. What else can I tell you? This is her second book, and her first novel, Near to the Wild Heart, was published to great acclaim. People began to compare her to Virginia Woolf and Franz Kafka and Proust and many other great world writers. That novel was actually published after she finished writing this one. So for my friends who are novelists who talk about the second novel problem, where you've published your first novel, it does well, and then you get nervous and think, how can I write the next one? What if nothing comes? What if it's terrible? She kind of skirted that issue by just pouring out her second novel before the first one even hit the presses. And I think that's very interesting as well. Because if you compare the two books, they're quite different, and yet they're also very linked. Both protagonists, The Chandelier's protagonist's name is Virginia. The protagonist of Near to the Wild Heart is a young woman named Joanna who's emerging into the world and trying to find her future. Both of those protagonists are growing up and becoming women in the world and trying to find their way, and yet the novels are very different because while Near to the Wild Heart has chapters with titles and kind of scenes that are almost, could be out of a play, and even moments where the main character speaks in the first person, The Chandelier doesn't even really have section breaks. that you have kind of pages upon pages of text, almost like this dense forest of quiet farm where Virginia grows up. So I'm going to read a few sections of the book for you, and I wanted to start actually with the first paragraph in Portuguese, just to give you a sensation of the language and the rhythms and the musicality. When I was working on the translation, I felt that there were sort of two parallel modes of translation. One was thinking about the language itself and its meaning, and of course the story and getting the verbs right and all of that, and at the same time the rhythms, the music, the tension, all of those things. And Lispector, for her, music was incredibly important, and she actually wrote while listening to classical music, which I find incredibly interesting, as someone who generally writes just with the quiet or the noise in my head. So here's the opening paragraph of O Lustre, that's the title in Portuguese, and the novel is dedicated to her sister, a minha irmã Tânia. Ela seria fluida durante toda a vida. Porém, o que dominara seus contornos e os atraíra a centro, o que a iluminara contra o mundo e lhe dera íntimo poder fora ao segredo. Nunca saberia pensar nele em termos claros, temendo invadir e dissolver a sua imagem. No entanto, ele formara no seu interior núcleo longínquo e vivo e jamais perdera a mágia. Sustentava-a na sua vaguidão insolúvel como a única realidade que para ela sempre deveria ser a perdida. Os dois se debruçavam sobre o ponte frágil e Virginia sentia os pés nus vacilaram de insegurança, como se estivessem soltos sobre o redemônio calmo das águas. There's a lot of water imagery from the very beginning, which you'll hear now. She'd be flowing all her life. But what had dominated her edges and attracted them toward a center, what had illuminated her against the world and given her intimate power, was the secret. She'd never know how to think of it in clear terms, afraid to invade and dissolve its image. Yet it had formed in her interior a far-off and living nucleus, and had never lost the magic. It sustained her in her unsolvable vagueness, like the single reality that for her should always be the lost one. The two of them were leaning over the fragile bridge, and Virginia was feeling her bare feet falter insecurely as if they were dangling atop the calm whirl of the waters. It was a violent and dry day, in broad fixed colors. The trees were creaking beneath the warm wind wrinkled by swift, cool drafts. The thin and torn girlish dress was pierced by shivers of coolness. With her serious mouth pressed against the dead branch of the bridge, Virginia was plunging her distracted eyes into the waters. Suddenly she'd frozen, tense and light. Look! Daniel, who's her brother, had turned his head quickly. Stuck on a rock was a wet hat, heavy and dark with water. The running river was tugging it with brutality, and it was putting up a fight. Until losing its final strength, it was taken by the light current, and in leaps disappeared into the foam, almost happy. They hesitated, surprised. "We can't tell anyone," whispered Virginia finally, her voice distant and dizzy. Yes, even Daniel had been frightened and was agreeing. The waters kept flowing. "Not even if they ask us about the drought." "Yes," Virginia almost shouted. Both fell silent with strength, their eyes bulging and ferocious. "Virginia," her brother said slowly, with a rawness that left his face all angles, "I will swear." "Yes, my God, but one always swears." Daniel was thinking while looking at her, and she wasn't moving her face, waiting for him to find in her the answer. For example, that everything that we are turns to nothing if we speak of this to anyone. So the novel opens with Virginia and her brother Daniel in the forest. They see something. They think they've seen a man drowning, and it's this secret that they decide not to tell anybody about. And as you read, you'll see that surely this is not the only secret between these two siblings. There are a lot of things kind of brewing in their relationship. They're the younger two of three kids. Their older sister, Esmeralda, is of courting age. She's going to these dances, and her mother goes with her, and she's very taken up by that, and the mother is very sort of occupied with that. So these other two siblings are kind of left to their own devices. They create together a pact that they call the Society of Shadows. And I want to read to you guys a little section where the two of them are talking about this Society of Shadows and what it entails. Had it been because of the drowned man that the Society of Shadows was born, they had foreseen the charmed and dangerous beginning of the unknown, the momentum that came from fear. Daniel said to her, "Let us create the Society of Shadows." Even before learning what it was about, Virginia had already confusedly understood with her body and consented. The Society of Shadows had strange and undefined objectives. They themselves did not know them, and it mixed its commands with an almost desperate ignorance. The Society of Shadows must explore the forest. Yes, but why? Near the mansion, there was an almost closed path, and along it you could reach the darkness. Yes, the darkness, but why? Because solitude. Solitude is the motto of the society, Daniel ordered. What? Virginia was having trouble understanding. Everything that frightens because it leaves us alone is what we must seek. He was hesitating. He would hover for an instant, drifting, his thinking intersecting with hers like the bow over the violin string, light sparks of insight and surprise unmaking themselves in the air. Days would go by without a single word being added about the society, without either daring to touch that living, shapeless matter. But they hadn't forgotten. They had to be quiet in order to create a pause in the dread that was already dominating them, and in that happiness that would make Virginia shake, her eyes undemonstrative. The Society of Shadows was bringing her so close to Daniel. He would allow her to be with him every day. Even she loved secrets with ferocity as if they were of her own kind. And truth, she was asking? What truth? Another motto should be truth. Yes, Daniel would get annoyed. It was so hard for him to be directed even a single time by Virginia. So they have this kind of conflictive relationship. He's the older brother. He bosses her around. He sends her on these missions through the Society of Shadows to do these terrible things, like he has a box of spiders that he collects, and he says to her, "Virginia, your next mission for the Society of Shadows is to stick your eye in the hole of the box," it's like a shoebox, "and stare at the spiders, and count to 1,000 or something like that." And she does that, but something happens with one of the spiders. She gets some poison in her eye, and then her eye gets swollen, and it's this whole kind of process. Her body is really affected by it, and then for the rest of the novel, her eye is never quite the same. And when the spiders die, because they're in this box and it's left in a hiding place, but then it rains and it gets soggy and they die, he barks at her and says, "You have to go throw that box away." He won't touch them. It's like, it reminds me of when I was a kid, and you'd have someone trying to tell you what to do, but maybe they were actually scared of the spiders more than you were. And you kind of had to be the brave one and the lackey at the same time. So she goes through these things, but she also has a very private and personal relationship to the Society of Shadows and to everything else in the novel. So it's very interesting to get these moments where she's interacting with someone like Daniel, or when she gets older and she and her brother actually moved to the city, and there's a very long scene at a dinner party, so she's engaging with other women her age. She can be very awkward and very almost distanced from the people she's trying to talk to, but then she'll have a private connection to the moment, and it can be incredibly intense. So I just wanted to read a little paragraph about her talking about the Society of Shadows from her perspective. She was looking... a little water. She was looking at herself in the mirror, her white and delicate face lost in the half-light, her eyes open, her lips without expression. She was enjoying herself, liking that sleek, so sinuous way about her, her shaded hair, her small and skinny shoulders. "How lovely I am," she said. "Who will buy me? Who will buy me?" She'd give a quick smooch to the mirror. "Who will buy me? Agile, funny as if I were blonde, but I'm not blonde. I have lovely, cold, extraordinary brown hair. But I want someone to buy me so much that I'll kill myself," she exclaimed, and peering at her face, frightened by the phrase, proud of her own ardor. She laughed a fake guffaw, low and shining. Yes, she'd need a secret life in order to be able to exist. From one instant to the next, she was once again serious and tired. Her heart was beating in the shadow, slow and red. A new element, foreign until now, had penetrated in her body since the Society of Shadows had come to exist. Now she was learning that she was good, but that her goodness would not impede her badness. This feeling was almost old. It had been discovered days ago, and a new desire was touching her heart to free herself still more, to go beyond the limits of her life. It was a phrase without words that was rolling around her body like nothing more than a push. To go beyond the limits of my life. She didn't know what she was saying, looking at herself in the mirror in the guest room. I could kill them all, she was thinking with a smile and a new freedom, staring childishly at her image. She was waiting for an instant, watchful. But no, nothing had been created inside herself with the feeling provoked, neither joy nor fear. And where had the idea been born to her? I haven't even finished the paragraph. I just wanted to let you know I'm going to stop there. But that paragraph begins at the top of one page, and I went all the way to the bottom. And there is more, but I'm going to move on. And give you something to look forward to when you read the book yourself. There's a section at this party when she leaves the party, and she has this boyfriend named Vicente. So they leave this dinner party, but she actually leaves with him and this other friend, Adriano. So they're both guys and Virginia are in a taxi cab all together. And then this strange thing happens where, and this is not the only time in the book, I wanted to give you a sense of this, where it's a scene that's happening, and then it seems to blur into, I don't know, is it fantasy? Is it dream? Is it both? Is it memory? And Lispector is really playing there with our perception of reality and how thoughts flow and how perception flows and how memory works. And I think it's also a very interesting section because the book, she wrote it between 1943 and 44, and it was published in 1946. It took her 2 years to get a publisher, even though her first book was a pretty good hit. The original publisher of that book wouldn't take it. So, but what I'm trying to say is that this book came out a fair amount of time ago, and yet the blurriness and the confusion and what's really happening with these two men in this taxi cab, to me, resonates with a lot of the conversations we're having culturally right now about people and relationships and consent and bodies and who remembers what or who experienced what. The car was gliding smoothly. That's the taxi. In the tepid interior, the motor was breathing like a heart. The motor was breathing like a heart. With extreme comfort and yearning, she shrank between Vicente and Adriano. With eyes shining and hard from whiskey, they had all been drinking a lot at the party, they were talking while coming closer to Virginia, feeling the heat of her body, staring eyes dissimulating brief words. Amid her sleepiness, she felt a bit unhappy and abandoned, heavy eyelids, lips numb and cynical. In a fluctuating and fleeting crisis, she wanted to be protected, for someone to defend her. Consider her excessively pure to be touched like that, airing and stirring her. Between the two men, comfort was deepening her. From the street, sounds of solitary horns were coming. Her pupils dampened with sleep, she was peering at the shadow. Without realizing it, she dozed a little, clutching with vigor in her lap the wide hat that was swimming white atop the half-light. She had been wearing a hat at the party. Seeing as in a dream the lights blinking in the empty city. The trip was so fast that soon she was undoing the sheets from the bed, opening her lips, saying a name full of softness and darkness, Vicente. The flowers were shuddering, vivid in the darkness, as if she were dissolving and plunging into her own dissolved matter, and in the milky and translucent darkness she herself was gliding as a pure fish, swinging her serenely resplendent tail. Yes, Vicente. She was moving ahead without fear and without hurry, her big limpid eyes closed through herself, while the man was moving away with another man inside a taxi through the city, accompanied by the way that she was missing both of them, squeezing her and insulting her, leaning on her in the back of the car. The neighbor's clock suddenly moved, struck 3 transparent notes on 3 levels of sound, the first high and scared, almost solidifying her in the beginning of a vigil, the second containing itself between the first, and the one to come the last, lower, pacifying, each separated from the next, and brilliant, like diamonds separated from one another and brilliant. But the 3 notes were liquid, and diamonds would never fear breaking in a single confusion. She went on undone in a great thick sea, and crossing it filled with a calm that was made of satisfaction, of the feeling in the deep car, of hope, of memories scattering. With the beating of eyelids, she was changing the level of her inner existence. And as you can see, the body is very important in the book. Throughout Lispector's work, you will often get these doctor figures and these encounters between main characters and the world of medicine, which I think is a really interesting theme in her work in general. And there's a scene with a doctor in the Chandelier that I think is incredibly interesting. There have been some great reviews of this book, which has been really thrilling, and one of the reviews that came out in the New York Times talks about how this novel is kind of like a seed for all of her other work. Since it's her second novel, and it's kind of dense and very lyrical and very layered, the idea in this review is that, you kind of get everything in there that she would then unfurl in her later novels and stories. And I think there's a lot to that. And so I think this is a doctor that we see in other texts of Lispector's later. The next day, yet it had been at that time, she visited the young doctor. He was laughing, imitating her. With a falsely paternal demeanor, he would brush his body against hers, brush against her cheek that face with 2 days of beard growth, while on the other cheek he was giving her little slaps. While she, surprised and confused, was feeling almost good, very good. He was tall and pale, and women were worthless to him. He had a wedding ring. How could you ever guess his relations with his wife? He was getting closer in that calm, white office, and she was still sitting on the table where he'd examined her quickly. He'd had 2 nights of childbirth in a row, he'd said at the beginning with tact and ceremony. Hadn't even been able to shave, he was saying as she was taking off her hat while carefully storing the hairpins. And after he examined her, they sat talking. He was losing his coldness, joking so intimately, so distantly, in the white, clean office, seeing her as just anyone, desiring her without sadness, not even waiting for her to let him try something, just wanting to make himself desired, cheerful, mischievous, and distracted, having fun with his own virility, yet serious, his eyes watchful and mobile. And so the other thing I want to say about this scene is that the novel is filled with inappropriate and awkward moments. And as you can see in this one, Virginia is an agent. She's not completely passive. She's thinking, what are his relations like with his wife? I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who's ever had that kind of not the right thought when you're in the middle of getting introduced to someone or something at a dinner party. And so there's a kind of frankness and honesty to the book that I think was very appealing as I was working on it, and I hope is appealing to readers. Lispector is also a great writer of dialogue. And I want to give you a little scene that's mostly dialogue between Virginia and her boyfriend Vicenci. They're hanging out together at his place. He gave a frank and happy guffaw, and while laughing was looking at her attentive, surprised. "Keep going, baby." She was gaining confidence, like a dog grooming itself. She closed her radiant eyes, went on with her blushing hot face. The body from back then died beneath the windows that were opening onto the pink, Vicenci. She herself was laughing. Should she stop, she was wondering? Because she'd end up saying something excessive, good morning so-and-so, ruining even the past. But he was laughing, extremely amused, and she couldn't help it. So fascinating it was to feel herself loved. He was laughing without embarrassment, getting uglier, his face open, suddenly like brother and sister, like from the same family, like people who expect nothing from each other, my God. If she'd only known that to win him over she had to close her eyes and speak. If she'd only known. It was with a bit of sadness and eyes sparkling with laughter that she went on. Darling, darling, little green flower in the white guitar. Boy, boy, little green flower in the moonlight, in the moonlight, in the moonlight. No, Vicenci was saying, excited and speaking seriously. What you should do to get it right is not think. Exactly not think, he smiled. You're a little like the improvisers of serenades, He was suddenly looking confused. Adriano must like to know that you have that gift. Why? She asked, less cheerful. Remember, Adriano's the friend who was in the taxi with him. Well, he thinks you're interesting. I think he really likes you. He was answering, almost exchanging a look with her about the oddity of the fact. Yes, it was like a night of glory. She laughed, quietly soft, her eyes full of overwhelmed and dreamy moisture. Staring at her, Vicenci felt his heart surrender. A sweet, warm, and suffocating foam enveloped him. His eyes were tame, smiling. She was looking. He'd never been so beautiful. With a kind and simple voice, he said, blowing lightly on her face, "I love you, girl." He'd hardly said it, however, without transforming the power of his face and even trying to keep it in order to follow the new feeling with freedom. He realized imperceptibly that he didn't love her, that he loved her maybe precisely before saying, "I love you." Enraged with himself, he wanted to take back what he'd said while observing Virginia's face so frightened and translucent. Could that be the first time he'd said it? He wondered with surprise and reproach. He'd said too much. He'd said too much. He was thinking, looking at her with fatigue and pity. "Your hair's falling in your face," he said with a disguised rudeness. And that's how he was saying again that it wasn't love. But almost impatient, he was feeling that it would be impossible now to rob her of the "I love you." And she was smiling with a joy that was making her unlikable, such a bore. "Let's go out, take a stroll," he said, annihilated. So, I think now might be a good time to open the conversation and see if any of you guys have any questions about the book or about Lispector, which I'll answer to the best of my ability, or comments. I wish it had been. She passed away in 1977. So, yeah, but there have been, many people have translated her since the time she started writing, and she herself was a translator from English, Spanish, and French into Portuguese. I've talked to many recent translators of Lispector about what happens when you start working on her texts and how she kind of visits you and talks to you. So I definitely felt a connectivity, even though I didn't get to have kind of an in-the-flesh collaborative experience with her. Yes. Oh, yes. This novel has never been translated into English before as a complete text, but I just found out, and I can't believe I didn't know this before, but Hélène Sixou did translate a section of it. And so it was really cool to read her version of the first sentence and think about all of the grappling I did with the first sentence, and then what I ended up sending was my sort of, this is going to be my first official pass at the first sentence, and then what we ended up with. And then I've since had conversations with other translators about how the first sentence could be different. That's just the first sentence, which in Portuguese is ela seria fluida durante toda a vida. So it has a rhyme, right? But that's going to be hard to do in English. She'd be flowing all her life. Doesn't have a rhyme, and I'd been thinking about she would be fluid all her life. She would be fluid all her life, where the D sound sort of repeats, but it's not exactly a rhyme. And then Sixou actually has that, but she did something different where she turned that first sentence, she continues it with the next sentence. She put a comma and then continued it, but that's not what Lispector did. So anyway, you can go on and on with these kinds of conversations. This is what translators love. Yes?
In the first passage you read, I detected 3 minimum instances of alliteration.
Yes.
And I was wondering, is this something you're conscious of? If you are conscious of it, do you consciously resist the temptation to alliterate or avoid? Or if it's in the original writing, you seem to repeat it? Like what I picked up is distant Disney, leaping lights, something else. But it didn't appear in the other passage. It's just in the first one.
Right.
And I thought, well, maybe that's just a translation.
No, I would say that her writing is very lyrical, very poetic, and many people consider her a kind of poet. I mean, she's a prose writer, but and she's definitely plays with syntax in Portuguese in a way that poets do. So when you translate, you want to not only be loyal to things like alliteration, or sometimes alliteration can be like compensating for something else you can't bring into the English. And you're like, oh, but I have this opportunity to alliterate, and it's not exactly the same thing as, for example, a rhyme or some other kind of use of language, but it kind of appears. So you kind of have to weigh each instance. But I think you would not want to force an alliteration or create it if it weren't there, or if something very similar to that play of language, sonic play of language, were not there.
In that first passage where you want alliteration,
Yes. Oh, you have to be on alliteration watch the whole time. The whole novel. It can't cease at any moment. But her first paragraph is more formal, more poetic, more dense. It's really setting up this kind of nucleus, this secret, this magic. It's almost like an incantation or a spell. I could, if you want, I could read. Well, I already read that first paragraph, so I don't want to do it again because you guys already heard that. But I'm looking here to see if I can find an example of the alliteration that we would have used. We're definitely not, translators are not going to invent things that aren't there. But for example, on the second page, there's a paragraph that starts in Portuguese. Ele falara tão grave, ele falara tão belo, o rio rolava. So you have that repetition and that the river is rolling, right? And so just as an example, let's pull up that same sentence in the English. He had spoken so seriously, he had spoken so beautifully, the river was rolling, the river was rolling. So you want to get a feeling, and different. There are different schools of translation. Some translators might say, well, I want it to be as exactly technically literal as possible. Other people say, well, it has to really capture the spirit and the artistry, and that's going to be a little more qualitative and maybe even subjective at times. I've spoken to some people who are writers of fiction or poetry and get to work with their translators, and some of them, a mentor of mine actually, who's a Brazilian poet and translator, he has this book of sonnets that I'm trying to work on, and he wrote me an email and he said, that's a nice try, but really I'd like you to just go for it and make it a poem, which I felt was permission to then just, go all kinds of crazy and kind of almost recreate the work, and there are translators and writers who believe that. And some people also believe that a translation can be more faithful to the original text than the original text was, if it's executed in an extremely felicitous way. Like I've researched and written a lot about Elizabeth Bishop, who translated Clarice Lispector, and Bishop also translated Octavio Paz. They knew each other and they actually translated each other. Well, she translated one of his poems about the artist Joseph Cornell. And when she did it, she wrote Paz this letter, and she was very sheepish about it. She said, I think maybe, the penultimate stanza could be moved in terms of the order of the poem, and it would have kind of a better structure. And he wrote her back, and he said, Dear Elizabeth, you've solved it. This is perfect. I'm going to change it in the original. You've improved my poem. So the answer is it depends. But I would say in the case of this book, absolutely, the lyricism and the poetry and the sound is something that was very important to try to capture in English as best as possible. Yes, Tom. Yes. No. I wanted every adjective. It is kind of a more Baroque, almost type book, novel compared to other works of hers. But no, because I think that excess, you could describe it that way, is there for a reason. And there's a scholar who's writing about the Chandelier in this book about a bunch of novels from the second half of the 20th century, and she's based at UChicago, and she's comparing the way the novelists write about nature and the style of the prose. And so one of the things I understand that she's talking about with the Chandelier is the forest is so important, and that nature, the countryside where Virginia grows up, it really dominates the novel in terms of its actual prose. It's almost this dense, impenetrable foliage of prose. And so, but I do think that there is space for for example, a translation of O Lustre into Portuguese or English or some other language that really whittles it down. That, I think, would be really cool. Like if someone wanted to turn the chandelier into haiku, or something else like a silent film. I mean, how would you do that? I have no idea, but it would be, I think, an interesting experiment. And I did get to speak to some people who knew Lispector and translated her, and one of them was telling me that Lispector had a very generous sense of what translation was, and really invited and liked to have her work translated in all kinds of ways in other mediums. And then I learned that her first novel was staged as a play in 1965 in Rio when Lispector was still alive, and apparently she had played a role in the play as an actor. I don't know what yet. I have to keep researching that, but I thought that was very interesting as well. Yes? Oh, thank you. Yes. I first read Lispector. The first book of hers I read is The Hour of the Star, which is her final novel, which was published in 1977, right before she died. And it's been translated a couple times into English. I read it in 2001 when I was living in Chile, where I was born. I was teaching ESL at this international school, and the headmasters were Dickensian. They were awful. And I had one friend, and she was the teacher that I was ESL helper for. So she was teaching her international baccalaureate students The Hour of the Star. And I was blown away by this book. It was so crazy. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to do so. It's also very slim. It's very compact, and I believe very connected to the Chandelier. The two main characters, Virginia and Macabea in The Hour of the Star, there are similarities in their life stories that are not an accident. And so reading that novel at that time, living in Chile, was like a very powerful personal experience for me. And then I started grad school at UCLA in the fall of 2001 and started learning Portuguese, and fell into this project of researching Elizabeth Bishop, who had translated Lispector. And then I went to Brazil for the first time and fell in love with that and started researching in Lispector's archives. So I've been working on her work for a very, very, very long time. And when the opportunity to work on a translation came up, I was thrilled. And it felt that, if nothing else, because I'd been reading her work and studying it for so long, that I would be up for the challenge as best I could. And it's been really fun to join a kind of, I guess, posse of translators. And there's a couple different generations of translators, I would say. Like, the New Directions has been publishing these new translations, and there are translations that came before from other publishers, and many of those translators are still alive. I was able to go to Oxford in November to this conference all about Lispector, and so there were scholars and translators and writers from all over the world there. I got to meet the woman who's translated 2 of Lispector's novels into Chinese, and she gave a really interesting talk about that, and it's such a different language. You know, I studied Chinese for a couple of years in high school, but didn't really learn it, so I don't know it, but I know enough to know the sound, the lyricism. It's a completely different. You know, like if you're a composer, it's a completely different scale and etc. toolkit. So that's been really, really a lot of fun. And I last year, when I was working on the translation, truly became sort of mad, and ended up doing this. I ended up doing this one-woman show for the Hollywood Fringe Festival, which is every June. It's happening right now again, and it was called "I Want to Be Robert De Niro," and it was about a woman named Magdalena who was translating O Lustre, the Chandelier, into English, who got into a fight with the main character, with the novelist rather, with Lispector, because she felt that Lispector was too tough with her main character. That Virginia's life was too tragic, it was too awful, we need to change the story, and Lispector was having none of it. And it's been so interesting to look back on that and think about what was even happening, and then to find out that she participated in the staging of her first novel as a play in Rio was like thrilling for me to find that out much later. So yeah.
It's generally agreed upon that this book is quite beautiful, right? To me, she sort of looked like what I've seen in
Yeah, I mean, this is, well, there, you can see more of her face, but if there is a copy also of, they must have a copy in the store of the complete stories, yes, but what you're...
In the transmutation into this character, she seems very unabashed about the response to the
Yes.
would you say that is something that the author, being very well assessed, verbal, and articulate, and yet beautiful, shares?
I mean, I think that definitely there's so many ways to answer this question. One way to answer it is to talk about Lispector's presence on Twitter. So her face, her likeness, because she is so striking, and there's kind of this mysteriousness and this glamour. People have written about that. Other people have written about how that's annoying and how irritating that, people are comparing her to actresses. She was a serious writer. If she were a man, no one would do that. Her words and her likeness, and the likeness of two particular Brazilian actresses who've played her, are all over Twitter. And there's one in particular, her name is Rita Elmore, who did a one-woman show in '98 when she was like 20, where she plays Lispector. And she looks so much like her that there have been tweets, like, for example, LitHub tweeted an excerpt of this novel, which was wonderful, right? Like, hey, here's an excerpt from the Chandelier, it's so great, read it, with a photograph of Rita Elmore, not of Clarice Lispector, right? And Rita Elmore, so that one-woman show she did in 1998 was like her debut into the world of acting in Brazil. She's done a bunch of soap operas and TV and film since, and theater too, but she can't shake Lispector. So she wrote a new one-woman show that she started performing like 2 years ago about her relationship with Lispector, and how now she's like this double or this doppelganger for Lispector, and that's because of the way she looks. So there are many ways to answer this question, and I think specifically the Chandelier, in terms of Virginia, the body is very important throughout the book. Her awakening about her body, her awareness, its power, how she feels about it, what is she feeling, her sensations, her connectivity with men or other creatures, with the air, with dreams, and so I think that's also very interesting, because you think 1943 and 44 is a pretty conservative time. I mean, you're not, of course. Well, I could go in a different direction, but it's even the things Virginia herself is experiencing. She goes to see the doctor. She has a hat. She's putting the pins away. There's a formality, right? And yet, in that prose, you're also getting a lot of intimate details, and from a female perspective, that. I'm not a historian of novels about women in the 40s, but I would be interested to know how many other such novels that aren't sort of straightforwardly erotica, for example, exist that would do those kinds of things. And the other thing I would encourage you guys all to read, and I brought it to show you today, it's sort of apropos, is this amazing essay that Katrina Dodson, who translated all of Lispector's stories into English, wrote, that just came out in The Believer, and it's the title, it's the first essay here. The title is Understanding is the Proof of Error. Will the real Clarice Lispector please stand up? A translator grasps for the words to convey a Brazilian icon. So Lispector's now, she's becoming this kind of, or has already become this kind of world literature superstar, who's all over social media, as well as has body doubles who can't shake her. It's very interesting. And here's one last detail to sort of circuitously answer your question. The scholar and translator of Lispector, who I've talked to a lot, who knew her quite well, described to me her living room. So you'd go into her living room, and she worked also as a journalist and interviewed a lot of people, to pay her bills. She became a single mom. She left her diplomat husband eventually. She kind of tired of the diplomat wife's life and moved with her 2 boys back to Brazil and had to, pay her own way. So she had various newspaper columns and was doing all kinds of writing for hire. Anyway, you apparently would go into her living room, and it was this apartment in Copacabana in Rio, and it was filled with photographs and paintings of Lispector, just from the floor to the ceiling, and from the way she described it. And to me, that feels almost like a proto Instagram feed, filled with these selfies and portraits. And so I think she was always playing with image and the visual, and that's another way that she's such a writer of our current moment, which to me is so fascinating. So I leave you with that image of her living room, which I wish I could have been in. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I did not have trouble with punctuation because this novel doesn't have anything too wacky or confusing. Definitely, we wanted to be loyal to the original text, but also remember that there's other New Directions books that have come out recently before this one. So this translation is part of kind of a constellation. So I did, for example, I brought it with me today. Refer back to Alison Entriken's wonderful translation of Near to the Wild Heart, which I've just listened to as an audiobook. It's so cool to hear it. To see, because this is Lispector's first novel, which she published just a couple years before The Chandelier, to see, what did Alison do with punctuation? I didn't have that specific, but if I'd had that question, or more specifically, like a particular word, I'm translating word X as this in The Chandelier, but I bet that word is in Near to the Wild Heart. How did Alison do it? And did we do it the same way? If we did, that's great. If we didn't, do I need to change something? Is this because and that can even happen within a novel where do you have to translate word X in Portuguese the same way every time into English or not? But her later books and stories have a punchiness and have a I don't know if I want to use the word avant-garde exactly, but The Chandelier didn't have that challenge. Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. And it's so cool that you bring that up, because when I was listening to Near to the Wild Heart as an audiobook, I realized that there are these amazing sections in this novel that are like monologues that, like an actor could take on and do, and you don't quite have that in The Chandelier. And why didn't she do it? So, but that would be an interesting experimental kind of translation, right? Like someone could say, I'm going to do a sequence of monologues that are Virginia speaking from The Chandelier, and let's see what happens. And I think from all the people I've talked to and the things that I've read, that Clarice would give her blessing if someone wanted to do that. So if any of you want to, you should. I think you'll get another, but let's go with someone over here who hasn't had a chance first. Yeah. Right. When there's not something that's so straightforward, I would say in the case of Lispector, has it come up in another book? And can I get a clue from that? Or what have other translators who've had to deal with similar words done? And like, what do my native Brazilian Portuguese speaker friends have to say about that? So you definitely have to go and ask people or books questions, and sometimes you have to sort of go with something that's good enough, but it's not going to quite be what you wanted it to be. And then occasionally you can have, that didn't really happen here, but you can ask yourself, do we even want to translate this into English? Maybe we keep it in the original. So one of the novels of the New Directions translations, it kept the title from Portuguese, Água Viva. Didn't, so that's also a choice depending on the moment or the context. So I think that I'm going to answer it that way. Yeah. Yes. Right. Yes. I would say first that one of the other Lispector translators has talked to me about her sensation of like how Lispector changes from the beginning of her career toward the end, and she even ventured to say there are some translators who can do like later Lispector, but they couldn't do earlier Lispector, or vice versa, right? And because like the later Lispector, I mean, there's always a sense of humor, but the later Lispector has a punchiness and a humor and a brashness almost to it that might, maybe you can't get that tone. One of my favorite writers is Virginia Woolf. And I remember many years ago now, I was a teaching assistant at UCLA when I was a grad student there, and I was teaching Orlando. I don't know if you guys have read that novel by Virginia Woolf. It's so great. And it's her like least Woolfian novel. And I thought my students were going to love it. Like, Orlando, it's so cool. And there's that film, with Tilda Swinton and Billy Zane. And they would, like, the sentences made them insane because they're so long and they're so demanding. And for me, I was like, what are you talking about? And then I realized, like, you had to track this sort of labyrinth. And so I think for me in English, because I love that writer, and I also grew up speaking Spanish, so I have that romance language background where sentences can be super long and you have a clause and a clause and a clause and a clause and it just keeps going. And I guess just my connection to Lispector, those are parts of my toolkit. When I was translating, I really wanted to focus more on the music and what you're describing than fussing so much initially on like the verb tense or things like that I felt you can obviously fix. Like, that's what revision and editing is for, right? And you're going to have to go over the text many, many, many times. But that kind of hypnotic, almost trance-like choreography, if you break the spell, you break the spell. So the days of work were very intense and very focused and sort of like very draining, and in a way very physical. But I think because your whole body is tuned in, and because she's writing so much about the body, and because, as you say, she's kind of moving this way, and then she goes that way, and then maybe like that. So it's not, subject, verb, object. Yes. Oh, you did? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. Right. Right. That's a great question. And so personal, I love it. So when the first time I went to Brazil, I fell in love with the specific place where I was, which was Rio, which I know is one city in a very big country that has many different kinds of cities and subcultures and so on. But I felt so connected and so kind of in a way at home because I was born in Chile to Chilean parents who moved to the U.S. when I was a baby. They were supposed to move back to South America, but they never did. So I grew up passing totally as a gringa, but I wasn't. And my parents have accents, like my girlfriends' moms would call to arrange a play date. My mom would answer the phone. They thought my mom was the maid because she has an accent, and the accent is still there so many years later. My parents speak accented English. That's the way it is. And I was, I had a green card. I was a legal alien. At least we were not, like all these families now facing that. Yeah, it's very hard. So that kind of hybridity and that insider-outsider status, do you pass, do you not, appropriateness, the Catholicism. I mean, Clarice's family was Jewish, but, and Brazil has other religions as well and has a kind of synchronicity and the candomblé and all of this, but Catholicism is very powerful in Brazil. And, Chile is also a Catholic country. So that thing of being, appropriate and having your legs crossed, wearing a nice dress, having your hair combed, all of these things are things that I know on a cellular level from growing up. When I was speaking this morning to the people at the Brazilian Bilingual Book Club in London, and there were many Brazilians in that group, it was wonderful to learn about so many things that I didn't necessarily know, like even, for example, that Brejo Alto and Grande Quieta in Olustre, the localities, there are apparently 43 brejos in the northeast of Brazil, and these are these kind of microclimates that are sort of forest-like but cold and very lush, and the people who were from those areas or had family from those areas were going on and on about these microclimates and the nature and the poeticizing, and I've never been there. I don't know that. So there are certain things that you have to trust that the text will give it to you. And there are a lot of translators who translate things that they don't know, like can a man translate a book written by a woman? Or can, someone like Paulo Henrique Espírito, who's my mentor in Brazil, who translates Faulkner into Portuguese, like he's never been to where Faulkner, but he's a damn good translator. So I would never want to say that I don't think people can translate things that they are not personally connected to, because I think literature is freedom, and translation is also a way for us to explore and grow and experience things that we don't know. I would also say that for me, I do feel, while not being a Brazilian and not having the exact experience Clarice did, I do feel a lot of personal connection, yeah. No, thank you so much. Yes. Yes. So, Benjamin Moser is the series editor of the translations that New Directions has been publishing. So it's not any co-translator that I've been listed with. He also wrote a biography of Lispector that came out in 2009 with Oxford, and has now been translated into Portuguese and many other languages. So he's a force. He's very dedicated to Lispector, knows her work extremely well, and is at the helm of these new translations. So, that's going to be an intense relationship. At the same time, I can say that I met Ben a million years ago when he was researching his biography of Lispector, and I was working on my dissertation on Elizabeth Bishop. And we met in Rio at the house of a friend in common, as it turned out, and then I gave him a chapter for my dissertation on Bishop and Lispector, and we swapped stories. So the good news is that I've kind of, in a way, known him, from early days, and we've sort of come up, I wouldn't say together, because I haven't been doing all the things that he's been doing, and vice versa, but, there's history there. And so I think what's interesting about the Lispector case is it's translatable to other cases where a writer becomes very kind of a hot property, kind of like I said before, a world literature superstar. The stakes go up. Who's in charge? Who's the expert? Who has the keys to the kingdom? Ben has really promoted Lispector in a new way. And more people are reading her work because of everything that he's done. I think that that's really an excellent thing. So overall, for me, to participate, to be part of this kind of new constellation of translators and also join all the translators who have ever worked on Lispector has been a really exciting experience. Sometimes you don't agree, and you have to, through the process of revision and whatever, you have to come to, what did you say? Well, I wasn't going to say blows. I was going to say compromise, or someone gets the final word or whatever. But when Ben first asked me to do the translation, I at first panicked and I said, "Oh no, this book has not been translated into English before. That's a lot of pressure." But then I thought, no problem. It will be translated by other people, right? Let this be the first of many. And with, for example, the Odyssey, Emily Wilson's new translation is so exciting, and nobody is saying, let's throw away all the other translations. We're comparing them, and we want to know what she is doing differently. And, it's so exciting to have her as kind of a new translator of that great text. So I would hope that there will be many, many more translators to come of Lispector into English and into many other languages. I think maybe we should what time is it? Does anybody know, actually? Is it 8:40? Are we good? Should we wrap it up, or? One or two? Okay, so one or two. So we'll go with you, and then...
No, that's my third question.
Yes.
You kind of stepped into what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Because, back to that first passage particularly, the imagery of the fish and light and stuff, I sort of connected with the lighthouse.
Right. Yeah.
There's one little passage where she talks about these fish. They're sort of isolated, really tied to them.
Right.
Looking at them in the reflections and comparing them to the fish and those things.
Yes.
And so I was thinking, okay, Virginia, was that a tribute?
We talked about this morning. Someone asked me if I thought that Lispector named Virginia after Virginia Woolf. I've definitely been thinking a lot about that. I recommend that you guys, if you're curious, look up Lispector's only filmed interview that we have. It's about 20 minutes long. She gave it right before she died, a few months before she died. It's so amazing. She says in the interview that she's having a bad day and she's not very fun that day and has a good sense of humor, and usually, she's not like that. But nonetheless, she's very playful and doesn't want to be pinned down. The interviewer keeps asking her, who are your influences? Can you name your influence? He's this very formal, I believe the interview took place in Sao Paulo. He's this very formal kind of, cultural critic, interviewer type guy. And she doesn't want to tell him. She says, well, I'm going to forget somebody and they're going to get their feelings hurt, so I just don't want to say anything. And he tries a couple more times, and then he tries different versions of that question, as a professional writer, how has your experience been? And then she cuts him off. She's like, I'm not a professional writer. I'm an amateur. That's how I maintain my freedom. And I love that, because she just does not want to be placed in any particular spot or category. She is very fluid and flowing. And so I think with the Virginia Woolf question, if we were to ask her, she would not answer in any direct way. There is a letter that she wrote I think to one of her sisters where she talks about Virginia Woolf, because people compared her writing to Woolf's. She didn't like being compared to anybody. And she said, Virginia Woolf, no. And by the way, our duty is to go on to the bitter end. So sort of criticizing in a way Woolf for, killing herself by drowning herself. For me, the fact that the main character is Virginia, she and her brother Daniel think they see a man drowning in the very first, paragraphs of the book. I don't think that's a mistake. But I wouldn't say that it's explicitly only Virginia Woolf, because of course the name Virginia is, the virgin, virginal. And so you have this young woman and she goes through then all of these experiences that fits very well with everything that's happening in the novel in terms of her body and her being and her spirit. Thank you so much, everybody. I'll hang around if you have any other questions. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.